Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat, the place where I talk about just a few of the things that make this little guy tick. Today, I'm going to be talking about The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2. Join me, won't you? Well, the Hunger Games return for their epic conclusion. This time, though, those games aren't comprised simply of tributes being forced to combat one another in an elaborate arena with booby traps and genetically modified animals, but an all-out war between the rebelling districts, led by everyone's favorite Mockingjay, Katniss Everdeen, versus the Capitol and the evil President Snow. Now, I've got to admit, I wasn't a huge fan of the Hunger Games series starting out. I found that first film surprisingly dull, with just lackluster directing and photography and editing that were distracting more than anything. It also just did a poor job at world building. And it's not that I mind a limited or smaller point of view in a film, but that film had no point of view at all. Ultimately, though, it was really the script where it fell the flattest. As an adaptation, it was just far too dependent upon the audience's knowledge of the book for them to connect with the characters in the film in any real or significant way. I mean, I was constantly asking myself, wait, when did these two characters become friends? When did Katniss and Hamish become friends? And how about that apparent tight bond between Katniss and Jena? There's even a scene in Catching Fire, which is the second film, where Katniss references one of the fallen characters from the first film as a close friend of hers. But as tearful as she was, I could remember no such emotional connection truly existing. Also in that first film, there was just far too much telling versus showing. Characters constantly popping up and telling Katniss, ooh, remember this because, or do that because. I will say, though, about 3/4 of the way through that first film, something interesting did happen when the character of Rue died in the games. When the people from her district saw that and started to revolt, things started to feel a lot more personal and a lot more real. And fortunately, that was a feeling that continued to grow film to film as the series progressed. And for that, I really have to commend the writers, as well as the director of the last 3 films, Francis Lawrence. I personally thought he really made as much as he could of the seeds planted in scenes like the one I just mentioned, showcasing much stronger imagery of a world that's really crumbling. More importantly still, he brought the audience emotionally into this journey, allowing them to view the events from a specific, empathetic point of view. Nonetheless, the weaker adaptation from the first film, as well as examples of other book series that have tried to split their final book into multiple parts, from The Hobbit to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, to Twilight, Breaking Dawn Parts 1 and 2, some of which were truly horrid. I will admit, therefore, that I did have some trepidation going into this final film of the Hunger Games series, because if I looked at those previous examples, a lot of their Part 1s tended to be on the slower, exposition-heavy side of things, and a lot of their Part 2s kind of ended up being nothing more than one big long action sequence. Interestingly, though, in my opinion, the challenge of dividing one book into multiple films isn't actually much different than adapting one whole book into one whole film. In both cases, the writer should always be seeking to ensure that their film is engaging, satisfying, and coherent. And if they get to the end of the writing process and look back at their script and realize, wow, that's just a bunch of repetitive dialogue scenes. Or they look back and go, wow, that's just one big bloated action sequence. I really don't think they should go, well, job well done though, that's going to be a satisfying film. Because what that says to me is that writer has no interest in adapting that piece of literature, but actually just transcribing it word for word to draw things out as long as humanly possible to make as much money as humanly possible. So, how does The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 fare? Well, for starters, and this probably comes as no surprise to any of you, but you really have to have seen the previous installments and remember exactly where the last one left off to really have any clue as to what's going on at the beginning of this film. Who the players are, what their relationship is to one another, where they were left on the board. So in that regard, it's kind of like a television episode, except without the previously on Game of Thrones. Or to make another comparison, it's not too dissimilar to the Lord of the Rings series in that regard as well. But also like each of those films in that series, the Mockingjay Part 2 really did seem to have a specific individual narrative emotionally, one which I found to have a great standalone build to it. Additionally, this film also had a great, strong point of view. As large as things got on this film, it really remained a very personal story, always following Katniss as she sought to defend her friends and family and exact revenge on those that had wronged them. There were still a few elements that were told versus shown, such as what Peeta experienced in the previous film at the hand of his captors, but even there, though, we were still very clearly shown the consequences of that captivity on his face and in his actions. Also, some people might criticize the film for being overly grim, and though the tone is dark, I personally never found the direction or writing monotone, as the action, stakes, and character relationships were constantly rising and falling, growing and evolving. Something else that's often present in these divided up adaptations is just that feeling of overindulgence. You're watching a scene and thinking, wow, in any other film this scene would have hit the cutting room floor a long time ago. But just because the filmmakers have to maintain that certain running time to prove and justify to the audience that they were right in splitting this book into multiple parts, it stayed in. Like almost half of Breaking Dawn Parts 1 and 2. And I have to admit that The Hunger Games, especially in these last 2 installments, did fall prey to that a few different times. As far as the action goes in this film, I just found it cool that the series was able to, in each installment, provide some sort of Hunger Game. And cooler still that it was able to adequately justify Katniss's continued involvement in them. This time it's the capital city which the evil game makers have booby-trapped. And speaking of such, it was really cool to see the director, Francis Lawrence, kind of continue to hone and refine some of the images and monsters that he kind of been playing with on previous films of his. So whether it's the abandoned post-apocalyptic city from I Am Legend, or the crazy demonic creatures from Constantine. And of course this review would not be complete if I didn't at least mention Jennifer Lawrence and her portrayal of the Mockingjay. Actually, similar to the character of Harry Potter, the character of Katniss Everdeen, especially in that first film, tends to react a lot more than act. So it's PETA professing his love, or the sponsors sending her gifts while in the games, or the game makers changing the rules of the game. So it's been really great to see her in each film become more of an interesting and active character who's not just reacting and obeying her basic survival instincts. From the outset, though, Jennifer Lawrence has always made this character believable. Even as the Mockingjay Part 1 endeavored to reduce her to a self-pitying teenager, she was always invested and able to keep things interesting, and the Mockingjay Part 2 is no exception. And as far as the rest of the cast goes, it never hurts to have actors like Julianne Moore or Donald Sutherland. I particularly appreciated what the writers of Mr. Sutherland did with the character of President Snow on this film. And not to spoil anything, but his evolution felt similar to that of Voldemort, actually, in Harry Potter Deathly Hallows Part 2, as we were shown a slightly different side to his customarily strong and ruthless persona. So, does the ending of the Hunger Games franchise make it a story worth investing our time and hearts into? I would say for the most part, yes. For what would be classified as a young adult series, I really felt like each installment matured things more and more, ultimately climaxing with this final film, which I felt actually grappled with ideas and issues that I thought were far beyond the capabilities of this series. Now, obviously, I won't spoil the ending for you guys, but I found it was so pleasing in that it not only connected directly to the inciting incident from the first film, that act of sacrifice and love that kicked this whole journey off for Katniss, but was beautifully reminiscent of other great pieces of literature that dealt with the fallouts of war and hardship, such as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Now, I've got to be frank, had I not gone to the opening night of this film and been surrounded by the unavoidably contagious enthusiasm of all the teenagers around me, I might have given this film a slightly lower rating than I'm about to. But as it was, I rather enjoyed the experience and will therefore give Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 3.5 out of 5. Those are my thoughts anyways. I would still love to know what you guys think, so please comment below. Let me know if you loved the film, did you hate it? What do you think was the best film in the Hunger Games series? Please comment below and let me know. Also, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you all to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.